In early April 1945, at an airfield deep inside occupied Germany, George Stevens and his camera crew filmed rows of German aircraft captured largely intact by American forces. Among them were Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, once feared by Allied and Soviet pilots alike. For nearly 10 months, Stevens, a celebrated Hollywood director, had been filming the war in Europe, producing a visual record unlike any other. His use of color film gave unprecedented realism to the final collapse of Nazi power. The Luftwaffe could no longer stop the Allied advance across the Rhine, and the outcome of the war in the West was no longer in doubt. Stevens and his men were witnesses to the regime's final unraveling. In towns such as Bad Wildungen, spared the worst of the fighting, American military authorities imposed strict controls on civilian life. Curfews, travel restrictions, and bans on communication. Nazi organizations were dissolved, and former members were ordered to report to US commanders. As American units pushed eastward, they were accompanied by film crews documenting every stage of the advance. Pontoon bridges spanned rivers to maintain supply lines, while obstacles were blasted aside without hesitation. Eisenhower's decision to halt at the Elbe and leave Berlin to the Red Army marked a decisive strategic choice, one already communicated to Stalin. Nothing, however, slowed the American momentum on the ground. Across Thuringia, towns fell with minimal resistance, though isolated fighting continued. Some German soldiers surrendered willingly, ignoring fanatical orders from Nazi leaders demanding resistance to the death. Diaries from both sides revealed the truth. Morale among German troops had collapsed. Lacking leadership, equipment, and hope, many wandered aimlessly, seeking only to survive. The scale of surrender soon overwhelmed American forces. Vast numbers of German prisoners were held in makeshift camps along the Rhine, including the infamous Golden Mile. With inadequate food, shelter, and sanitation, conditions were dire. Disease and exhaustion claimed thousands of lives, a grim reminder that suffering did not end with surrender. For civilians, the end of bombing brought relief mixed with uncertainty. Children played among ruins, cautiously approaching American soldiers who offered chocolate and chewing gum. Former Hitler youth members laid aside weapons and tried to reclaim their childhoods. Refugees streamed westward in endless columns, fleeing the approaching Red Army and the chaos left behind. The most harrowing scenes came with the liberation of concentration camps. At Mittelbau-Dora and Buchenwald, Stevens filmed evidence of systematic brutality, emaciated survivors, mass death, and underground factories where prisoners had been worked to exhaustion building V2 rockets. Hardened combat veterans were shaken to the core. Many admitted they had doubted reports of Nazi crimes until they saw them with their own eyes. American commanders forced local German civilians to confront the camps, hoping knowledge would bring responsibility. Reactions ranged from shock to denial, but the truth could no longer be hidden. These images would later be used as evidence, ensuring the crimes were recorded for history. By mid-April, Leipzig fell, and resistance dwindled to isolated pockets of fanaticism. Suicides among Nazi officials underscored the regime's collapse. German soldiers now sought one goal above all else: surrender to the Americans rather than face Soviet captivity. On April 25, 1945, near the Elbe River, tens of thousands of German troops laid down their arms. 2 days later, near Torgau, American and Soviet forces met for the first time. The encounter, carefully staged for the cameras, symbolized victory over Nazi Germany. Soldiers exchanged smiles, drinks, and toasts, celebrating the unity that had won the war. For the world, the meeting at the Elbe marked the end of Hitler's last hopes. Yet beneath the celebrations lay the seeds of a new conflict. The alliance forged in war would soon fracture. Still, in that moment, captured in color by George Stevens, there was relief, triumph, and the fragile promise of peace. In early April 1945, American troops were advancing rapidly through the heart of Nazi Germany. Organized resistance in the West was collapsing, and the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Following close behind the front lines was a unique observer of history, Hollywood director George Stevens. Serving with the U.S. Army's Special Film Project 186, Stevens and his camera teams documented the final weeks of the Third Reich using 16mm color film, creating an unparalleled visual record of victory, destruction, and human suffering. At captured airfields deep inside occupied territory, Stevens filmed rows of German aircraft that had fallen into American hands. Among them were Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, once symbols of German air power and feared by Allied pilots. Now they stood abandoned and powerless. The Luftwaffe, once a decisive force, was incapable of contesting Allied air superiority. With the Rhine River crossed and supply lines firmly established, the Western Allies faced little that could slow their advance. In towns such as Bad Wildungen, which had escaped heavy bombing, American forces imposed strict military rule. Curfews limited civilian movement, transportation was prohibited, and all communication systems were shut down. Members of Nazi organizations, the Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS, and Volkssturm, were ordered to report to American command posts. These measures marked the complete collapse of Nazi authority and the beginning of Allied occupation. As US units moved eastward, engineers constructed pontoon bridges to ensure uninterrupted supply. Defensive positions, roadblocks, and fortified buildings were destroyed without hesitation. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had already decided that Berlin would be left to the Red Army, a decision communicated directly to Joseph Stalin. On the ground, however, American soldiers focused solely on advancing, securing territory, and compelling German surrender. Across Thuringia, the Americans entered towns and villages that had only recently experienced air raids and artillery fire. Some surrendered without resistance, while others fought on under orders from Berlin to defend every position to the last man. These orders, issued by fanatical Nazi leaders, cost countless lives in the war's final days. Yet morale among German troops was visibly collapsing. Diaries and eyewitness accounts revealed despair, confusion, and a profound sense of abandonment. Supplies were exhausted, leadership had disintegrated, and belief in victory was gone. Increasingly, German soldiers chose surrender over meaningless resistance. Young conscripts, some barely trained, laid down their weapons despite threats of execution for desertion. Nazi propaganda continued to demand victory or death, but reality made such slogans hollow. Entire units dissolved as American forces advanced, and prisoners of war streamed westward in unprecedented numbers. The scale of surrender quickly overwhelmed American forces. Along the Rhine, enormous makeshift prisoner-of-war camps were established, including the vast enclosure later known as the Golden Mile. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were confined behind barbed wire with little shelter. Food was scarce, sanitation was poor, and exposure to cold and rain took a deadly toll. Disease spread rapidly, and thousands died from dysentery, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Though the fighting was nearly over, suffering continued. For German civilians, the end of organized combat brought relief mixed with fear and uncertainty. In occupied towns, people struggled to secure food, find shelter, and adapt to life under foreign rule. Children played among ruins that had become their everyday environment. Many had grown up without fathers, who were either killed in battle or now held as prisoners of war. Former members of the Hitler Youth, once trained to defend the regime with weapons, were suddenly free to return to childhood, though the psychological scars remained. Refugees crowded the roads heading westward. Families from East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia had fled for weeks or months, driven by hunger and terror of the advancing Red Army. They traveled in horse-drawn carts or on foot, carrying what little they owned. Caught between collapsing German forces and advancing Allied armies, civilians often found themselves trapped in chaos. As American units pushed deeper into central Germany, they encountered evidence of Nazi crimes on a scale few had imagined. Near Nordhausen, Stevens and his team were granted permission to film the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Hidden underground, prisoners had been forced to construct V-2 rockets under appalling conditions. The surviving inmates were skeletal, exhausted, and barely alive. Many others had been sent on death marches only days before liberation. The scenes shocked even the most battle-hardened soldiers. The stench of death was overwhelming, and piles of corpses testified to systematic cruelty. Stevens later wrote of people reduced to nameless shadows, stripped of identity and dignity. For many American soldiers, this was the moment when the true nature of the Nazi regime became undeniable. Reports they had once doubted were now tragically confirmed. Nearby towns were filled with liberated forced laborers from across Europe. French prisoners of war, deported after France's defeat in 1940, began their long journey home. For years, they had worked in agriculture and industry under harsh conditions, receiving barely enough food to survive. Now, thin and exhausted, they moved westward with a mixture of relief, uncertainty, and hope. On April 16, 1945, Stevens filmed the liberation of Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar. Established in 1937, it was one of the largest camps in the Third Reich. Tens of thousands had died there from starvation, disease, execution, and medical experimentation. The surviving prisoners were desperately weak, thousands were critically ill, and hundreds died each day, even after liberation. The camp's proximity to the cultural city of Weimar starkly highlighted the moral collapse of German society. American authorities forced local civilians to visit Buchenwald, compelling them to confront the crimes committed in their name. Some reacted with shock, others with denial, and some collapsed in horror. Journalists such as Edward R. Murrow reported from the camp, describing scenes that defied language. These reports, together with Stevens' color footage, would shape global understanding of the Holocaust and ensure the crimes could never be denied. Military operations continued alongside these revelations. Leipzig fell on April 19th after only limited resistance. In the town hall, American cameramen documented the suicides of Nazi officials who chose death rather than face capture. Even in the final days, fanatical believers clung to propaganda promises of victory. Isolated groups of soldiers, Hitler Youth members, and Volkssturm units continued to fight until crushed by artillery and air support. By late April, the Elbe River marked the farthest point of the American advance. Thousands of German soldiers rushed toward American lines, desperate to avoid Soviet captivity. Entire formations surrendered voluntarily. American aircraft dropped leaflets instructing German troops how to surrender in an orderly fashion. Over just a few days, tens of thousands laid down their arms without a fight. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet forces stood facing one another across the Elbe. 2 days later, near the town of Torgau, they met formally. The encounter was carefully staged, filmed by multiple camera crews, and broadcast around the world. Soldiers exchanged handshakes, smiles, and jokes. Vodka, champagne, and cognac were shared in celebration. For a brief moment, the alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany appeared unbreakable. World leaders hailed the meeting as a symbol of unity and imminent victory. US President Harry S. Truman declared that Hitler's last hope had been extinguished. Journalists described scenes of camaraderie and relief. The war in Europe was effectively over. Yet beneath the celebrations lay the seeds of a new political reality. The same river that symbolized unity would soon divide Europe. Within weeks of victory, tensions between former allies would surface, shaping the Cold War and the post-war world. For George Stevens, the journey ended far from Berlin, but his mission was fulfilled. He had captured the collapse of Nazi Germany in vivid color, military triumph, unimaginable suffering, and the fragile emergence of peace. His images remain a powerful reminder that the end of war does not erase its consequences, and that bearing witness is itself an act of history. By the end of April 1945, the guns in central Germany were falling silent. What remained was a shattered land filled with ruins, refugees, prisoners, and survivors struggling to comprehend the scale of what had just occurred. For the soldiers who had fought their way across Europe, the war had ended not with a single decisive moment, but with a gradual realization that the enemy no longer existed as a coherent force. The Third Reich had collapsed, not in glory, but in exhaustion, fear, and denial. George Stevens and his camera teams stood at the center of this historical turning point. Their footage captured more than military victory. It documented a world emerging from catastrophe, a society stripped of ideology and illusion. In vivid color, Stevens recorded the faces of defeated soldiers, starving prisoners, displaced civilians, and liberated victims. Images that would forever challenge any attempt to forget or rewrite the past. The meeting of American and Soviet troops on the Elbe symbolized the culmination of a shared struggle. It was celebrated as a moment of unity, proof that cooperation between vastly different systems had been possible in the face of absolute evil. Soldiers who only days earlier had been killing and dying now embraced, toasted, and laughed together. For many of them, it felt as if history itself had paused to acknowledge their survival. Yet even in that moment of triumph, the future was already casting its shadow. The Elbe did not merely mark the end of the war, it foreshadowed a division to come. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was built on necessity, not trust. Political differences, mutual suspicion, and competing visions for post-war Europe would soon fracture the unity so visibly displayed at Torgau. Within a few short years, the river that had united armies would become part of an ideological boundary, dividing an entire continent. For Germany, defeat meant more than the loss of a war. It meant confrontation with responsibility. Cities lay in ruins, millions were homeless, and families were permanently broken. Even more devastating was the moral reckoning forced upon the population by the liberation of the concentration camps. The evidence filmed by Stevens and others could not be denied. These were not isolated crimes nor the excesses of a few, but the result of a system built on dehumanization and violence. The images from Buchenwald, Mittelbau-Dora, and countless other camps became a visual indictment. They ensured that the suffering of the victims would not vanish with the smoke of crematoria or the collapse of barbed wire fences. Survivors carried the memory of those places in their bodies and minds, while the world was confronted with a responsibility to remember and to judge. For the American soldiers, the war's end brought relief, pride, and disorientation. Many returned home believing they had helped liberate Europe and defeat tyranny, only to struggle with memories that could not easily be set aside. Some had crossed oceans, endured combat, and witnessed horrors that reshaped their understanding of humanity. The celebration on the Elbe did not erase what they had seen. It merely marked the end of one chapter. George Stevens himself would never be the same. Before the war, he had been known for light-hearted Hollywood comedies. Afterward, the images he filmed in Germany haunted him. He preserved the footage carefully, understanding its historical importance. Years later, it would be used as evidence in war crimes trials and as a record for future generations, a silent but powerful testimony to where hatred and obedience can lead. As Europe moved into the uncertain peace of the post-war years, the meaning of victory continued to evolve. Liberation did not immediately bring justice, prosperity, or reconciliation. Instead, it opened a long and difficult process of rebuilding, of cities, nations, and moral frameworks. The war had ended, but its consequences would shape politics, borders, and lives for decades to come. The final images of April 1945 do not offer simple closure. They show joy and exhaustion, hope and grief, unity and division existing side by side. They remind us that history is not defined solely by dates and treaties, but by human experience, by the choices made under pressure and the responsibility carried afterward. In bearing witness to the fall of Nazi Germany, George Stevens and his camera teams gave the world more than documentation. They gave future generations the chance to see, to understand, and to remember. The lesson of those final days is not only that war can be won, but that peace must be defended through memory, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity. If you found this documentary meaningful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps preserve and share history for future generations.